There is now a report from the New York Times saying that Yahya Sinwar, the new leader of Hamas, has cut communication with the negotiators who are working that ceasefire hostage release deal. It's just one of the latest developments coming in as you take a look at the Israel-Lebanon border. Do want to bring in Mark Chandler. He is, of course, the director of government relations there at Coastal Carolina University and professor of practice, also a former senior defense intelligence official. Thank you so much for taking the time, as always, to be here with us.
Good morning, Josh, and you're welcome.
All right, so first off, Mark, obviously a lot to discuss, a lot of developments over just the past 24 hours, but do want to talk about this New York Times report, because to hear that Sinwar has essentially cut himself off from communications there, we also hear from others that he does not want a ceasefire because he's hoping that Israel will take some of the troops that are there in Gaza and move them over to the area where they're fighting Hezbollah. What goes through your mind? What do you make of all of that?
Well, when I first look at this and I heard what Sinwar was talking about, it takes me back to 1 year ago tomorrow, unfortunately, that tragic day a year ago tomorrow. And I look at that, and one of the statements that Hamas came out with, and one of their goals was to create this instability in the Middle East and if you will, to create an Arab uprising against Israel. Now it failed to do that. And while it was trying to do this, that furthered Iran's goals. And we can't forget that Iran is fully behind Hamas, the attack last October 7th, and then how they're fighting out there. So about the only thing we've seen develop from one of Hamas' goals is the axis of resistance, which I would say a year ago, most of your audience didn't realize what the axis of resistance was. And that's the Hamas, the Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iranian-backed Shia militia, and even Syria. So when I look at that group has coalesced and they are creating instability, but I don't think we've seen this massive uprising that Sinwar has looked about. To look at operations that scaling back that Israel would have to do, I don't think Israel's going to have to scale back anymore. It already has. They're going to focus on moving forward. The 162nd Division just started new operations in Gaza today to focus on these Hamas fighters. So it's more of a call for Hamas to do this, more of a Sinwar thing. The only bad part is while there may not be a general Arab uprising, if you will, against Israel, this is going to lead to a longer guerrilla type warfare that is going to be not in Israel's favor.
The idea of a ceasefire and hostage release deal, is that essentially only up to Sinwar and Netanyahu? Is anyone else really involved, and can anyone else make the decision?
Well, when I go back to earlier statements this week, it looked like all the countries that were involved in the mediation process came out and said about midweek that pretty much the negotiations are dead. They're no longer going to continue those negotiations. And I think, you talk about Netanyahu and you talk about Sinwar being the only decision makers. Really, I think Sinwar is the focus of what has happened here because he pulled out of those negotiations. He's the one that goes to your first question about wanting to create further instability in the Middle East. So all decisions are now going through him. And so when I look at that, it doesn't do him any good to go out there and negotiate the release of those remaining 100 hostages, of which 2/3 may be dead at this time. So you start to look at how this plays out. Absolutely, there is no more decision-making process among Hamas. It's Sinwar. It's Sinwar perhaps trying to be a martyr. It's Sinwar taking Hamas, the Palestinian people, down with him by having this intransigent approach to any kind of negotiations.
We heard from France's president and also a response from Netanyahu as Macron did say that there should be an arms embargo on any of the weapons that Israel's using in Gaza. Netanyahu had some very strong thoughts about that. Does France provide a lot of weapons to Israel that they use in Gaza? And is France really an ally of Israel?
Well, that's kind of a complicated issue, but I will tell you, it looks like, to use layman terms, Macron really stepped in at this time on this. So when we put it out there like that, he came out there. I think Macron's playing to a domestic audience, Josh. A couple of things. He called for snap elections over the summer, and that backfired on him. So you started to see his party lose ground inside France. France has a significant immigration process or problem that they have to deal with. So to answer part of your question, no, France less than 30 million, I think, in U.S. dollars of any kind of support they provide. So support that they would cut off would mean nothing to Israel. I think he really made the bad public statement by going out and saying this. France, first and foremost, is about France. They don't really care about anybody else. Macron especially is focused on France. So he's really playing, as I said, to that domestic audience. He shouldn't have come out publicly with this. So now that he has, I think within hours it didn't even take that long. After Netanyahu pushed back on Macron, you saw France stepping back from what Macron said, really saying we're a staunch ally. And so like the Middle East, France needs a good ally, a good democratic ally. That's Israel, just like the United States needs that ally in the Middle East. So, yes, France is for France, but they also support Israel. I think Macron needs to mend a few fences here with Netanyahu as we go forward, though.
We've talked about Hamas, Hezbollah over the last several weeks and months, but we've also talked about the Houthis, and I did want to get an update from you on that because you've been very well versed in kind of what they've been up to, and we don't hear about them as often, but they are pretty much wreaking havoc over there in the Red Sea, in the Middle East in general. So can you give me kind of an update as to what we've seen from the Houthis over the past several days and weeks?
Well, if we look at that, we had kind of a lull in Houthi activity from about 2 weeks ago. Now, earlier this week, first and foremost, hats off to Israel for conducting a significant strike against the Houthis last Sunday. They went in there, they took out some key infrastructure out there in and around the port of Hodeidah and around Sana'a. So you look at those strikes that they did, that was in retaliation for what the Houthis did a couple of weeks ago. So you see that attack. That didn't stop the Houthis this time because 2 days after the Israelis hit, the Houthis went very hard against some commercial shipping. They went after about 2 to 3 ships in a day and a half span in the Red Sea and in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So they started to hit those. Just Friday, the U.S. did some significant strikes, long overdue in my opinion. I don't like to give my opinion much, but long overdue to go after some key Houthi infrastructures. But here's the deal with the Houthis, Josh. As long as Iran and through the Iranian Quds Force can get more supplies in and more advisors into Yemen, the Houthis are going to continue their attacks. They did 2 attacks on Israel itself this week through missiles and UAVs. And those are not Houthi-made missiles. So as long as Iran can keep supplying, we're going to see the Houthis kind of pop in there and pop out, creating instability in the Red Sea, but also being kind of a problem for Israel's southern flank.
All right. Mark Chandler there with Coastal Carolina University, a friend of the show. Always love having you on to break down all the developments here. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
You're welcome, Josh. My pleasure.